He laughed at you.
He laughed at me because they weren't driving a truck with a horn. It was just like a box truck. And then just, I did that. And
Like you would a bus. You used to do that all the time. All right.
All right.
Okay.
We get VIP.
Yeah, you get the VIP treatment tonight.
We're going to go to
Just in
Israel.
time for Absalom's death. So yeah, they're wonderful.
All right, so a brief summary of what's going on. Absalom was the guy that killed his brother, that raped his sister. Totally family drama right there. And David, I still can't wrap my mind around it. And like, so David didn't do anything because technically David did the same thing. He committed murder of Bathsheba.
And when Nathan was Nathan.
Uriah, he murdered Bathsheba's.
Yeah, murdered Bathsheba's actual husband.
Yeah.
It was Nathan telling him that your family was going to be cursed, so he felt like
This
it
was
his
his
fault.
curse.
Yeah, I felt like it was his fault.
Okay.
But everything happened.
All right, and also Absalom is trying to convince people that he's the more the righteous king. Or
Yeah, he slept
he's-
with David's concubines on the roof in front of Israel. And then we learned the thing about the wedding. And
Yeah,
I was
that
like,
one. Yeah, that's.
I know we did ours wrong.
Oh, wow, jeez. Anyway, moving on. So he's causing all kinds of political drama, which doesn't sound like anything new compared to today. But anyway, or really history in general. So that's where my mind just totally goes blank after that, where he's causing the political drama and something about a lot of men, a lot of soldiers showing up. Some of them killed. Did they kill? I don't know. Was there any action? I'm sorry, my mind tuned out after that.
So where we are in the story is David's left town with a pretty sizable army, or he has gathered a sizable army after he crossed the Jordan River.
Okay.
So there's a lot of symbolism in crossing back over the Jordan River, basically out of the promised land into this no man's land. But David finds it's almost like the wilderness motif that you find in other areas of Scripture. It's in this place, this wilderness place, that David finds help. He has, not from his own people, but from others that he's befriended over the years that have come to provide him with supplies. And ultimately we see a Gittite who is not a part of the clans of Israel come and actually leads a third of his army in the place that we're coming to. So David has this, for lack of a better word, multi-clan army that is behind him. He also has the support of the priest of God. They've been called that twice before we get to this. And so there's this orbit around David that appears to be quite healthy now. So he's gone from being almost impotent in regards to the son that performed the rape. He didn't do anything about that. He, after Absalom kills his brother, he puts himself in this self-exile. David really lets Absalom have control over how he comes back into the kingdom. He makes demands that David bows to. Is basically what happens. And in that process, Absalom's able to run his dad out of town, and sets himself up to be the king. So we talked earlier about how there was a class struggle going on too. You had the palace population, the Jerusalem population, that was more supportive of David, but then Absalom had been able to gain the trust and admiration of the country folk. And so there was that clash going on as one left and then the other returns. That's important to remember, because when we get to the end of this section of Scripture, we see that everyone now is coming behind David. It's all over. It's been one of the worst chapters in biblical history. Nothing stands out like this until you get to, which we'll get to in 1st and 2nd Kings, where Ahab and Jezebel are doing their thing, and how bad that is. So this is pretty bad. And so now that David has left, and Absalom has accepted the advice of two different people, one loyal to him and one loyal to David, and we see in the midst of that God has already said that whatever Mephibosheth told Absalom to do it wasn't going to stand up. God had already decided that Absalom was going to be defeated. So, not even the love of David for his son, or the right advice that Absalom was getting was going to make any difference in any of this, because God had already determined he had chosen David, and those two things absolutely were not going to change his choice. And he had made a choice. And up until this time, there's no earning. David can't earn what God has given him, because we obviously can see there's nothing about his life that would say, oh, this is a righteous, upstanding life and everything's just going great and that's why God chose him. And there's nothing that you can look at in David's life and say, yeah, all of that's good. So we're left with this broad picture all the way through this entire episode with David, where we're left knowing that the reason why things happen when God's involved is because God's already made up his mind. And we can either be the best or we can be the worst, and it's not going to change what he's put into motion, because he has something going on that we can't see. So now, looking back from the cross, we can see. That's why the genealogies that are presented in Matthew and presented in Luke are important, because we're able to look back through time on paper and see everything that God had done. When we look all the way through that, we're thinking, wow, how does any of this happen? I mean, you know the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot's being rescued out of Sodom, and by the time that whole story's over, he's just left with him and his two virgin daughters, and they get him drunk, and they have sex with him, and they have two sons. Well, one of those sons and one of those daughters winds up in the lineage of Christ. So we see that even in that mess, God is able to say, but Ruth is going to come along and she's going to correct all of this that's happened. And we see all this happening in David's life, and we look forward and we say, but Jesus comes along and he's able to correct all these ugly, nasty things that have happened in David's life. So the theme that we begin to see in this is not only rescue. He's rescued his people out of slavery, and he's blessed them and all those things, but he is a God of restoration too. Even after the rescue, there's things that go horribly wrong, and God says, no big deal. I'm a restorer. And if I can do this in this story, think about what he can do in your story, is the lesson we learned, the broad, big lesson in this. And so we have to learn to look for what he's doing. So that's the big story. The more minute story today is this crazy story about how Absalom loses his life, and how David responds, and how Joab responds, and everybody's got a role here that makes perfect sense. The only thing that doesn't make sense is the way that Absalom is caught between heaven and earth, which we'll see here in just a minute. So, chapter 18, verse 1, David assembled the army that was with him. He appointed leaders. Second Samuel, chapter 18. So David assembled the armies that was with him. He appointed leaders over thousands and leaders of hundreds. David then sent out the army, a third under the leadership of Joab, a third under the leadership of Joab's brother, Abishai, son of Zeruiah, a third under the leadership of Ittai, the Gittite. The king said to the troops, I too will indeed march out with you. Remember how this whole thing started? It was springtime, the time where everybody goes to war, and David stayed home while Joab and the armies went out. And that's when he laid his eyes on Bathsheba. And all of this started falling apart. But here's the first time where we see again that it's time to go to battle. And David says, now I indeed am going to march out with you. But the soldiers replied, you should not do this. For if we should have to make a rapid retreat, they won't be concerned about us. Even if half of us should die, they won't be concerned. But you are like 10,000 of us. So it is better if you remain in the city for support. Then the king said to them, I will do whatever seems best to you. So what they're saying is, if you're out there on the battlefield and they catch sight of you, they're just going to go after you. And that's not going to be good. We'll lose our king. And then the rest of us are pretty much at the mercy of Absalom, and that's not where we want to be either. So the difference here is David humbly says, "Okay, I'm gonna yield to your advice," which is different than what we've seen in the past, and it's also different what we see later. He's in a moment here where he knows he needs to be sober in his decision making. So the king stayed beside the city gate, while all the army marched by hundreds and by thousands. The king gave this order to Joab, Abishai, and Ittai. For my sake, deal gently with the young man Absalom. Now the entire army was listening when the king gave all the leaders this order concerning Absalom. So everybody heard and everybody knew what David wanted. There was no way to say no one knew what was happening here. Then the army marched out to the field to fight against Israel. So, remembering that this is written, during after the divided kingdom, Israel being the northern kingdom, Judah being the southern kingdom. David was from Jerusalem and was a southern king, and the house of Saul identified with the northern kingdom. So the slaughter there. Wait a minute. They marched out to. Then the army marched out to the field to fight against Israel. The battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. The army of Israel was defeated there by David's men. The slaughter there was great that day. 20,000 soldiers were killed. So this is a 20,000 man loss in a civil war. Okay. Such drama. The battle there spread out over the whole area, and the forest consumed more soldiers than the sword devoured that day. So this is kind of give a geography lesson on what would be called the east bank of the Jordan, what would now be Lebanon and Palestine and all that. Very rocky, rough terrain. There's cedar forest and some other things there. So what David managed to do, without this explaining it, his army was able to draw Absalom's army up into these hills, and they didn't know where they were going. So it's full of pits, it's full of crags, it's full of rocky cliffs, and they were wandering around in there trying to fight, and as many of them died falling, and you know, as did by the sword. Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
so embarrassed.
That is an embarrassing.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
sad.
Yeah.
That's very. Did David meant to do that? Or is
Well,
that
it was definitely, I mean, they were fighting out in the field.
Yeah.
That's in the plain. And then next thing you know, they're fighting and it's spread out into
and
the forest.
Everything else.
Yeah. So why would that happen? Except that an army moves into the forest and the other army advances against that army. And, yeah.
I see. Okay, so basically lured them.
Yeah. So if you recall, when David was still fighting with the Philistines, he would raid this area of the country and defeat these people in the name of, and then he would go back to Ziklag and he would tell the Philistine king, yeah, I've been down there raiding the Hebrew people and this is all their stuff, when really he'd been across the river doing these other things. Yeah.
So it's just like soldiers on both sides, you think?
So he just knew more. And Joab knew more about the terrain because he'd been with David the whole time. And but the other side of this is what we get to next, is that it's the forest that takes Absalom. And this is in the next section. Then Absalom happened to come across David's men. So he's in the forest and he sees that, man, I got to get out of here. Come across David's men. So now Absalom was riding on his mule. Now when we think of riding on a mule, we think of that not being, hey,
we got a big
how y'all doing? Yeah, I don't know where everybody is. I know, I guess it's wet and nobody showed up.
Lots of cars out there.
Yeah?
Lost you. Maybe full house.
They're probably full. The ladies are probably full. I think they've got 4 or 5 helping in the youth
I think
too.
they are porch over here instead in the front.
Yeah. Trying to beat the rain. So we're in 2 Samuel chapter 18 and we're down to verse 9 now.
Thank you.
So in verse 9 we see that Absalom's riding a mule. Well, that was really the preferred animal to ride if you were royalty during this time, not a horse. And the reason why is, have you ever ridden a mule?
And they're just strong,
I've ridden a mule.
dirty.
Yeah, it is.
Man, that's a smooth ride animal. Yeah, they got a smooth ride. And
horse?
yeah, oh yeah, much smoother than a horse. But what it is too about a mule, I mean about a horse is, a horse you can train to be quick, agile on its feet, a war horse. Okay, but a mule, you're not ever going to do that. It's strictly for getting from one place to the other.
One speed.
Slow
Yeah,
pace.
yeah.
Oh, it's all there. Aren't they? I'm sorry, maybe I'm getting this confused, but are they stronger than a horse?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And I used to pack horses and mules when I lived in Colorado. I was a horse packer.
Yeah.
And you could put twice, maybe 3 times the amount of weight on a mule as you could on a horse.
Wow.
And the mule wasn't going anywhere that it didn't want to go. That's why he's getting stubborn as a mule.
Oh, okay.
Well, okay, you can make a horse go down a trail that it knows if I keep going, I'm going to die. But he's telling me to go, so I'm going to go anyway.
Mule?
A mule won't.
Oh, wow.
A mule will sit down. And I mean sit down. Because it ain't going. It's smarter than you when it comes to where he's going to put his feet. That's why they're very careful, they're sure-footed, they're easy to ride.
Also, the term mule training
Yeah.
holds lots of stuff.
Yeah, oh yeah. Yeah, I've somewhere in my stuff, I've got pictures. They moved a grand piano up to a mining facility back in the 1890s. And the only way you could get there was by mule. It was at the 0100, I think, outside of Silverton, Colorado. But I got pictures somewhere, and they would set up this tripod, and they would lift the piano up, and they would walk the mules under the piano, and 2 of them together. It's pretty remarkable.
2 mules?
2 mules.
For the grand
And they would carry it about 100 yards, move the tripod up there, lift the piano off the mules, and let them rest. And they do that. They did that all the way up this 3.5 mile trail. But anyway, yeah, so mules are amazing animals, and they were an animal of royalty. So when you see mule in the Old Testament, you got to kind of think high of the mule because it's much better than a horse. Yeah. So Absalom's riding his mule, and he went under the branches of a large oak tree here in this forest. His head got caught in the oak, and he suspended in midair, while the mule he had been riding just kept going. Because the mule's smarter than Absalom. If this dude wants to sit upright in his saddle and get his head caught in the limb, that's fine, but I'm going back to where I know I belong. So he's hanging there by his head. And of course, if we look back, we remember that Absalom had this great flowing hair. And so it's all the pictures you see of this that are art paintings through the centuries have Absalom dangling from a tree with his hair all tangled up in this tree, and he can't get down. Okay, so here's the absurdity. Okay, Absalom has been crafty. You remember he waited a long time before he killed his brother for his sister's rape. He waits 6 years to return to the city. He sits outside the city and really undercuts his dad with all the people that are coming to see King David for decisions and things that have to be settled. He does all these crafty things, and he fails in 2 places. He takes bad advice, which ultimately gave David time to establish himself in a part of the geography that he knew better than Absalom's army would know. And then he gets his head caught in a limb.
Yeah.
So it kind of brings the whole absurdity of Absalom down to this one moment. Here he is. He's gone through all of this to be deceitful and to gain what really wasn't his. And here he is hanging by his head in a tree, totally helpless, suspended between what Walter Brueggemann describes as hanging between life and death. There's just nowhere for him to go. He's suspended.
Sorry, what verse are you on again?
We are in verse 9.
2 Samuel 19?
2 Samuel 18. Yeah. When one of the men, or one of David's men, saw this, he reported it to Joab, saying, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree. Then Joab replied to the man who was telling him this, What? You saw this? Why did you strike him down right on the spot? I would have given you 10 pieces of silver and a commemorative belt. So this is Joab. Joab's all army. He's all soldier. He's all loyal. There's no reason to think about any of these things. As soon as David said, don't harm my son, Joab's thinking in his mind, under his breath, yeah, right.
Yeah.
This guy, remember, he burned Joab's field to get Joab's attention. He's had it with Absalom. And by this time, Joab knows how to handle David. He has carried David. This is a good friend. He has carried David through David's worst times and best times. And there's only one person that has remained, the one thread throughout David's life, through this whole thing that has remained, is Joab. And we see in that, not a big theological lesson to learn from this, but everybody needs somebody in their life that is going to be loyal, steadfast, and brutally honest about what has to happen and what needs to happen. And Joab was that person for David. And David, because he had Joab in his life, and we kind of see him bounce in and out of things, it's really why David had his kingdom. If it wouldn't have been for Joab, a lot of things would have gone differently. And, we say they would have. They would have occurred in a different manner. God had already staked this out the way it was going to end, but the way that it proceeded has a lot to do with the person of Joab. So he said, man, I'd have given you 10 pieces of silver and a rodeo belt. That's what I like to think every time I read this. I'm going to give you this belt that's got a buckle on it that says, I killed Absalom. He really wanted to make a big deal about it. But the man replied to Joab, even if I were receiving 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not strike the king's son. And then he comes back to it. You call him Absalom, I call him the king's son. In our very presence, the king gave this order to you and Abishai and Ittai: protect the young man Absalom for my sake. If I had acted at risk of my own life and nothing is hidden from the king, you would have abandoned me. So now he's dressing up Joab here a little bit. If I had done what you just said I should have done, and the word would have got back to the king, you would have said, yeah, that's the guy that did it. And I'd have lost my head. Okay, so Joab replied, I will not wait around like this for you. So he leaves that guy. He took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them into the middle of Absalom while he was still alive in the middle of the oak tree. Then 10 soldiers, who were Joab's armor bearers, struck Absalom and finished him off.
Jeez.
So, Pinata man, they just butchered him. The very opposite of what David said to do, they did. I mean, 3 spears would have been enough.
Oh yeah, that would have been plenty to kill him.
Yeah.
This guy, Joab, what he really wanted, Jesus, was retribution of his vengeance. That's what he really wanted.
That's exactly what's going on here.
Yeah, and he didn't. At this point, rationality is left.
Right.
And,
Brutality is all that remains.
yeah.
And so this is pretty brutal. But then it doesn't end. Then Joab blew the trumpet, and the army turned back from chasing Israel, for Joab had called for the army to halt. Then they took Absalom, threw him in a large pit in the forest, and stacked a huge pile of stones over him. Or really, not stacked is not the word. They threw him on him. In the meantime, all the Israelite soldiers fled to their homes. So we've got this other thing. We can look back a little ways, and Absalom actually built a monument to himself. He had children, but for some reason they were not close at all. You don't hear anything about them. And so he built this monument as a testimony to his life, so to speak. And here we have at the end of his life a pile of rocks giving testimony to his death. And not a whole lot in between to show for his life. So a life of vengeance, well, this is what it leads to, And we'll see later on what all happens to Joab. So before this, Absalom had set up a monument. Here he tells you all about it. And dedicated it to himself in the king's valley, reasoning, I have no son who will carry on my name, which he did, but we don't really know what happened. He named the monument after himself, and to this day it is known as Absalom's Memorial. So they bring that, the narrator brings that up as a way of contrasting the two. In the end, he still has no testimony. Whew, okay. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, let me run and give the king the good news that the Lord has vindicated him before his enemies. So here is the son of a priest who is saying, I want to deliver the news about what God has done here. So he's dressing up the whole thing. We all know that Joab's done the dirty deed, but the priest is interpreting it correctly. Ever since Nathan confronted David with his sin with Bathsheba, he's constantly been reminded by the priest in his life that God had his hand on him still. And we had a discussion about before with Saul. Saul messed up and God removed his hand. So if you do this, I will do this, but you didn't do this, so now I'm no longer doing that. But when we see David in his sin, God is saying, yeah, you did this, but nevertheless, I'm showing my mercy to you because you're a man after my own heart. Basically, it's the only reason we ever have for why he does what he does. We're never given a definition about what that means. We have to speculate all the way through. We keep coming up with reasons. Maybe this is why. Maybe this is why. Maybe this is why. The truth is, only God knows why. And God is so, for lack of a better word, he's so taken by it that he honors it. So to pursue God in that way is something that we all need to identify in our life. How does God see my heart? And we really, the only thing that we know, especially as believers in Jesus, when we know he sees us in a way that says, I'm offering my salvation even though they don't deserve it. And it's kind of like God says, okay, now we're going to see what happens because of that. Is it going to be one of those things where I do this and then there's this marvelous response, which is what the New Testament teaches? Or is it going to be one of these things where I do it and nevertheless it's going to matter? See? And so that comes to me, what does it mean to us? And so the picture that is presented here of David, we would think, well, David just, it's always nevertheless. Whatever David, God's just going to say, okay, it's just, I've chosen David, so I've chosen David. But then when we begin to look at the songs that David wrote while all of this is going on, and his response to certain events in his life, and the response to his own life, and then we begin to get the full picture of what this is, and we find that it's not God just saying nevertheless. This man David is responding back to everything in his life. He sees everything in his life as me being intricately and intimately involved with him. And so really it's the Psalms where we begin to get the full picture of David. And I wish I'd have had the time to put all of them together event by event so that we could have gone through and looked at that. But it's pretty easy to do when you look through the Psalms because most of the subheadings say when this was happening or when that was happening or this time in David's life. And you kind of you can go back and pair them up pretty well and begin to see the full nature of God, of David's faith in God. Let's see. But Joab said to Ahimaaz, says, you will not be a bearer of good news today. Meaning that whatever you say to David's not going to be good news. You think it's good news, but this isn't going to be good news to David. You will bear good news some other day, but not today, for the king's son is dead. So Joab already has it in his mind. Somebody's going down because Absalom is dead. And I don't want it to be my friend Ahimaaz that's going to have to suffer that. Then Joab said to the Cushite, Cush, Northern Africa, this is probably some long-legged African that can really run. I mean, that's what that whole area, that northeast corner of Africa, these are runners, man. They run.
Now, there's like a certain tribe though where the average, I think, man is 6'6", and the average woman is like 6'2".
And
but it's really incredible. But it's, I don't know. I thought it was interesting.
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's what it is. They're runners. And these guys, they were mercenary troops that had come. We always think of the world as being more fragmented during this time, like it's just getting going. Man, these people were international in a lot of ways. And so they were either mercenaries or these tribal people from Cush were recruited as messenger bearers during battles and things because they could get from one place to the other. So here's this Cushite. I don't even think we ever get his name. Go and tell the king what you have seen. So after bowing to Joab, the Cushite ran off Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, again spoke to Joab, whatever happens, let me go after the Cushites. So he's saying, I don't care what happens. I want to be the one to deliver this news. But Joab said, why is it that you want to go, my son? You have no good news that will bring you a reward. But he said, whatever happens, I want to go. So the traditional thing was, if somebody brought you a message, you tipped them. That's what he's talking about. When you get a reward, you get a tip for bringing it. So Joab said to him, then go. So Ahimaaz ran by the way of the Jordan plain, and he passed the Cushite. So Ahimaaz is pretty well known for his running ability too, which we'll see. Now David was sitting between the inner and the outer gates. So this town that he's in on the east bank of the Jordan evidently had a thick wall. It wasn't uncommon for walls around a city to be 6-8 feet thick. And they had a gate on this side of the wall, and they had a gate on this side of the wall. So it is a narrow thing that you pass through. David's sitting in that narrow place. So David's sitting there, and the watchman went up to the roof over the gate at the wall. When he looked, he saw a man running by himself. So the watchman called out and informed the king. The king says, if he is by himself, he brings good news. The runner came even closer. Then the watchman saw another man running. The watchman called to the gatekeeper, there is another man running by himself. And the king said, this one also is bringing good news. And the watchman said, it appears to be that the first runner is Ahimaaz, son of Zadok. The king said, he is a good man, and he comes with good news. Okay, so how many times the narrator is really pounding it home here. There's just hope after hope that everything's going to be good after this. Okay, and it's I love this narration. It's this dialogue. It's built in this. It's building up. They're getting closer. They're more recognizable. You can kind of feel the climax building for David. This is really good. Not just one runner is bringing good news. I got two runners bringing good news. Maybe it is that my son Absalom came to his senses and he surrendered and he's okay and the battle's over and I've won and we can go back and get back to the way things are. It's all going to be good. Then Ahimaaz called out and said to the king, greetings. And he bowed down before the king with his face toward the ground and said, may the Lord your God be praised because he has defeated the men who oppose my lord the king. Nothing, he says, is about Absalom. He just reports about the battle. And said that this is true. God has delivered just like he said he was going to do. No battle plan of Absalom was going to succeed because God had already said it wasn't going to work. So he bows down to the man who opposed my lord the king. Then the king replied, how is the young man Absalom? All that is on his mind is Absalom. So Ahimaaz replied, I saw a great deal of confusion when Joab was sending the king's servant and me, your servant, but I don't know what it was all about, which is a bald-faced lie. He knows he's not going to tell him the news because he might wind up with a spear in his own body. The king said, turn aside and take your place here. So he turned aside and waited. So he said, look, move out of the way. There's this other guy coming. He's bound to have some news. Yeah. Then the Cushite arrived and said, may my Lord the God now receive the good news. The Lord has vindicated you today and delivered you from the hand of all who have rebelled against you. The king asked the Cushite, how is the young man Absalom? And the Cushite replied, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who have plotted against you be like that young man. Which means what? He's dead. All right, so this is tough here because the king then became very upset. He went up to the upper room over the gate and wept. So you can imagine, he's told the whole army, and the whole army has heard, don't harm Absalom. And now he gets his news that he's not only dead, but they're celebrating the fact that he's dead. And so it's like he's about to boil over. So he goes upstairs into a room by himself and he weeps. And he said, my son Absalom, my son Absalom. If only I could have died in your place. Absalom, my son. So David is not seeing him in any other way than his son. Everybody else has seen him as an enemy. And this whole thing came about in a way where this battle was going to have to be fought. And David has been in this anguish the whole time, where this is his son. This is my son. This is my son. And he's probably thinking at this point, if only I had followed my instincts and gone into battle, maybe at least I too would have been killed. And I wouldn't have to be dealing with this grief. So once again, we see some things that are good and bad at the same time. When God said that he would appoint a king or anoint a king for his people, he was doing it for his people, right? He told Samuel way back in 1 Samuel, I want a savior for my people. And every time that, in Samuel and David's case, they were unable to keep their personal life out of their king life, which is exactly what God wanted. He wanted a man after his own heart that would allow the relationship that the king had with God to direct the kingly actions and behavior that would be for the people. But every time, the unavoidable truth of being a human being is that we sin against God, even a person like David. And now in the midst of all of this that has happened, it's been the whole root of it has been sinfulness. And David finds himself wishing that he could just die too. He'd be free of his sinfulness. He would be free of it all. That's the only way out. Okay? And yet David is the father of the one who gives us the only way out. And that's Jesus. There's only one way for us to have a relationship with the heavenly King and be the image of the King in this world, and that is through the Son, Jesus. So David didn't have what we have, but the drama is still the same. We still find ourselves in that same place. Oh, if I could only be rid of my sin and all that it's done. And years later, Jesus comes and says you can be rid of your sin and all that it's done. So, Old Testament people don't like you to read that much New Testament in all of this, but I do it anyway. They preach it. Anyway, so he's weeping and weeping. So here it is. You've got this army that has just fought, bled, many died for your king. And the king now wishes he was dead because they killed his enemy. So this is not sitting good with Joab and the rest of the army. In fact, this is really, it would seem, from Joab's position, he's looking at David and says, you're a whining, selfish person at this point. What is wrong with you? Get it together. You're a king. And this is where we are. Joab was told the king is weeping and mourning over Absalom. And of course, Joab's the one that killed him. So the victory of that day was turned into mourning as far as the people were concerned. For the people heard on that day, the king is grieved over his son. So here should be a great when you were victorious over your enemies in those days, the next thing that happened was a party. Because normally you would capture all the belongings of those people, and it would come back with the king, and the king would be celebrated for the victory, and all the people would join in that because the kind of a share the wealth thing. Okay, and so instead of it being a great day, a great feast day, here the king has turned it into this day of mourning, which doesn't sit well with the people that were out there in the field risking their lives for him. So that day the people stole away to go to the city the way people who are embarrassed to steal away and fleeing from battle. So it's kind of like they've hung their heads and they just wish now that they just weren't a part of any of this. This whole thing has been spoiled for them. The king covered his face and cried loudly, "My son Absalom, Absalom, my son, my son." So Joab visited the king at his home. We're still in Mahanaim. I think that's how you say it. I'm going to look it up. I'll probably say it wrong anyway, but yeah. Mahanaim. So he's still there, and he has a house there, evidently. Somebody's loaned him a house so he can have a house. So he visited him there and said, "Today you have embarrassed all your servants who have saved your life this day, as well as the lives of your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your concubines." So what's he saying here? Your house is intact because of what we did. Everybody's safe. If we'd have lost this thing, they'd have come in here, and what happened with the concubines back in Jerusalem after you left would have been the same thing that happened here. So he's reminding him that because of his army, you're still the king. And that's the only reason why, in Joab's opinion, that's the only reason why you're king. You seem to love your enemies and hate your friends. Pretty harsh words. For you have as much as declared today that leaders and servants don't matter to you. I realize now that if Absalom was alive and all of us were dead today, it would be all right with you. So remember when I said that you need somebody in your life that's going to be there through thick and thin and tell you the truth no matter how bad it hurts?
Yeah, sounds like he's he's retired from that department now. That's wow.
So
but I'm sorry. I know I'm interrupting.
No.
You know what? I got a lot to say, so I'm just going to say it.
Go ahead.
In a sense, though, I don't know. Like, as wrong as it was of Joab to slay Absalom, even when he was told not to do it, and when there were several witnesses that said not to. I mean, it's just like the motivation behind it. It's understandable. Not saying it's right, but it's just understandable. But also, I don't know. I think it's another thing. Joab, he's kind of really. Honestly, not only did he stab him with like I know it's just probably like a brutal imagery, but not only stabbing the knife, but he's also like twisting it. You know, like gut wrenching him basically on how you elevate your enemies higher than what we've done for you, and especially Joab, which is like the best of best friends, and all that. Geez, no, it's another imagery of man. I'm sure Joab wouldn't mind plunging into hell itself and back just for David's sake.
Yeah.
And all that, but now Joab, I don't know. I can kind of level with the guy a little bit, or I can understand. I'm sorry, not level with, but understand.
Yeah, see, I don't have any trouble with Joab.
Yeah.
None at all. Joab's role in David's life is really to be sort of a guardian angel. I'm going to do right by you even when you don't know what that is. In a military sense.
Yeah.
And really, he hasn't, maybe unknowingly, he's been serving God in all of that. Because God had it planned out. David is going to prevail. Well, Joab could be as much a part of the plan of God as anything that God has put forth in this. Okay? We never have that stated to us. The narrator never draws that much attention to Joab because he's just a good soldier. But God could have very easily. Joab's been preserved up to this point in David's life to accomplish the very thing that God intended for David's life. Even when David is all wrapped up in his emotions. And there's always that haunting thing in David's mind where he knows so much of this he put into motion. Either actively or passively. Actively by God having to declare to him what he did after the Bathsheba event. Passively, when he kind of just let the events of his children push him into a corner where he wouldn't do anything. He's all this. Don't y'all have days like that when you look back on your life and you think, man, what I'm experiencing right now is because of what I did before. And you kind of just have to sit there and take it. Well, Joab's the guy that says, you can sit there and take it, but I'm not. Okay? And ultimately, because I'm not, it's going to be better for you. And I think there's times in our life where we need people like that. Where we find ourselves vulnerable to our own situation and our own past and all those things. And you need somebody that's going to stand there and say, hey, you know what, you can sit there and have the pity party, but I'm not. And I'm going to get you through this. You know, diapers and all. You know, and that's Joab.
Diapers and all.
Yeah, diapers and all. Mighty babies. Yeah, there's a couple of songs written about this episode too, with Absalom and the whole deal.
I was just going to ask that if the Psalms embellish.
Oh yeah.
Absalom.
Oh yeah.
David's talking about.
Yeah, heart wrenching when he writes about that. So yeah, it's important to go back and look at the Psalms. I wish we'd have done it. Maybe we will before we move on into the Kings. You know, after the divided kingdom, we'll go back and look at some of those. It probably would be beneficial and to give us a chance to review some of this. I really think that this part of Israel's history we need to review pretty often. It's almost a foreshadow of what happens in the divided kingdom, and we begin to see that God's people never really learn a lot. They tend to repeat a whole lot, even though you've got this priestly line, and I think that's why the priestly line is there. It's this one cord that runs through everything, where they are constantly reminding the people this is not what God intends, until finally they become corrupt. And there's nobody left to carry God's torch, so to speak, and they wind up in exile. All right. So he said all of these things. So he says in verse 7, so get up now and go out and give some encouragement to your servants. For I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out there, not a single man will stay here with you tonight. So who's in charge of the army? David? No. You've all seen the movie Gladiator? Yeah, and after their final defeat of the marauding horde coming out of the north, everybody's afraid that the general, I can't even say his name now. No. I can't say the general's name. Maximus.
Yeah, Maximus.
They're all afraid that Maximus is going to come into Rome and take Rome, because he really was the commander of the army, not the emperor.
No.
They would do anything for Maximus. That's who they were loyal to. Well, that's what Joab is saying here. If you don't go out there and behave like a king, I can guarantee you, I'm leaving with your army. And then David would have had no army. Because now all his he's speaking of all these mercenaries that have come from other places, the men of Jerusalem. We just conquered everybody that lives in the northern kingdom. You've got nobody. So here we see again that Joab, this is another reason why I think that God has really put Joab in this place. Because Joab could have left that day and things would have really been different. The Philistines would have looked up and said, oh, there's Jerusalem, but no army. Let's go there. And the whole history of the people would have changed. But I really think Joab's, up to this time, he's been God's man with David to help hold all this together in the midst of all this family feud stuff that's been going on. This disaster will be worse for you than any disaster that has overtaken you from your youth right to this present time. So he gets a sweeping panoramic view. I've been with you since you were a kid, and here we are today. He says, if I walk out of here with this army, this is going to be the worst thing that ever happened to you. Ouch! Yep. So the king got up, washed his face, put on his good clothes, sat at the city gate. When all the people were informed that the king was sitting at the city gate, they all came before it. So David went down, and he's reviewing the troops. So it's his way of saying this is the way it was done. After a victory, the king or the general would stand. And Rome was famous for this. When you were victorious for Rome, you marched into Rome, and all the people would come, and the emperor would be there, and you were rewarded with his presence. And that's kind of what this is. The army had just won a great battle for their king, and he's come to show them his appreciation. And that's it. Okay? So that gets us through to the end of that, and then it picks up the rest of chapter 19, describes David going back into the city, into Jerusalem. And there's a lot of stuff here. We can't shove any of that. I mean, from verses 9 all the way to the end of the chapter, there's just one episode after another that deserves some attention. And then we kind of get back into a parallel of First Chronicles. But I don't think we're going to do that back and forth thing that I was doing before. It's pretty much all the same thing. There's nothing added except for some poetry. And we haven't really looked at any of the poetry in any of this, except for one passage with Hannah, and then we looked at one with David. So we'll look at the rest of it and go over all these individual things that have happened. You remember Mephibosheth, who was the wounded, the one that had been disabled. His nursemaid had fallen while she was running and mangled his foot, and it never healed right. He returns back into the story. His servant, who was his servant? I forget now. Not Shimei. That was the one throwing stones on David when he's brought back into the story. And so all these people that were there, it's almost like everybody that was there before David left, and kind of the drama that was around all of that. Remember, Mephibosheth didn't leave with David, so he gave all of Mephibosheth's land to his servant. Golly, I can't remember his name. Who?
Ziba?
Yeah, Ziba. Yeah. And so now, we'll get to it. David gives half of that land back to Mephibosheth, so there's a restoration occurring. Shimei says, oh, I dishonored you, king. I deserve punishment. And David says, oh, no, it's okay. I forgive you. So here we have on this way back in, restoration. Everything has been destroyed. I mean, David's gone through this whole cycle of destruction ever since his daughter's rape, really. And it's just been destruction, just running, rolling downhill crushing him, and he's made it through that, and now he's returning to the city of God, and he's in this restoration mode as he goes back. So that when he finally returns, when he finally takes his place in the palace and all of that, everything's kind of back the way it ought to be, and then he starts making mistakes again. So it should tell us all a great lesson, that is at the core of who we are. We get caught up in our own lives, and then we do some boneheaded things. And David did a boneheaded thing. We'll see. He took a census for the purpose of military conquest, because why? He's lost half his army. He killed half his army in this civil war. So now he's going to take a census. And God says, why are you doing that? We're finally back to a place where you can rely on me again to fight your battles, and you're out here you're preparing to do it yourself again. And there's no profit in it. You're going to lose every time. You lose. Even though you're still king, look at what all you have lost. Let me. That's the message. Just let me, God say this. Let me have this like I have intended ever since Saul, way back. But still, David gets that message, but he still tries to do some things on his own. He's still trying to find his place as being more than what God has called him to be. He's called him to shepherd his people. Be my servant and shepherd my people. Not a very high ranking in life. But I'm king. God's saying, but that's your mistake in not understanding what it means to be a king for me. And so we'll get to the end of all of that, and we'll move on to 1 Kings and look at all that. So.
But David's not exactly trying to be the servant leader that
he keeps falling back into that. And not that he's looking for a way to do it. It's just in our nature. It's in our nature to usurp God. Even when he's right there and has already said, all this stuff is going to happen, but you're still going to be my chosen one. It all happens. And at the end, David still is chosen one, and David still thinks, well, maybe I can contribute to the cause a little bit here. Yeah, and we tend to do the same thing. Things get going good, and we think, well, I've got some ideas about my life that ought to work. And God said, no, it's only working now because I have you solidly now in my grasp. And if you start trying to wiggle out of that, it's not going to be well. All right. Any other comments about any of that? It's one of those sad, tragic stories in the Bible. And we'll get to read a whole lot more of them going through 1 and 2 Kings. But yes, it is good stuff. I'll see y'all later. Or you'll see me later. I haven't seen you yet.